This list is full of evil people, killers both identified and not, and a few who were even able to get away with their crimes. Here is part 2 of the top 10 scariest criminals you've never heard of. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness was a Norwegian-American serial killer who is believed to have killed over 40 people, including her own family, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Belle was born in Norway in 1859 and immigrated to the United States in 1881. She settled in Chicago, where she married her first husband and started a family. This was all fine and well until things soon took quite the turn. Belle began to collect life insurance policies on her family members, and if you're a true crime fan, you likely know where this is going. She went on to eventually kill them in a fire. She then moved to LaPorte, Indiana, where she purchased a farm and continued to lure wealthy suitors to her property just to kill them for their money and assets. She was known for her physical strength and was able to bury her victims' bodies on her property. Belle's crimes were discovered in 1908 when a fire destroyed her farm and the remains of several of her victims were found. We love when the villain is brought to justice, but unfortunately, that did not happen here. Belle herself was never found, and it is believed that she may have faked her own death and fled the country. In our number 9 spot today, we have Dorothea Puente. You know the saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, this certainly is a case of that. If you took a glance at Dorothea and knew nothing about her, you'd probably assume she was someone's kind grandma who also had some cookies and a glass of milk waiting, but that could not be any further from the actual truth. In reality, she was actually a serial killer, and she decided to prey upon some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, people who were seeking help and assistance. Dorothea operated a large rooming house that was set in a large Victorian home in Sacramento, California. The residents who would often stay there were people who struggled with different substances such as alcohol, people who had been in mental hospitals, and the elderly. All of these people were receiving social security checks, and if they suddenly vanished, she figured no one would ask. In 1982, they did begin to vanish, but of course their social security checks were continually being cashed. As it turns out, Dorothea was taking their lives and then their money. She has now been called the landlady from hell. In our number 8 spot today, we have Yang Xinhai. You might be familiar with Yang already, as he is quite a notorious name in Chinese criminal history. Also known as the Monster Killer, Yang was a Chinese serial killer who killed at least 67 people between 2000 and 2003. Yang was born in 1968 in the central Chinese province of Henan, and he had a troubled childhood. He began his killing spree in 2000 when he started breaking into houses in rural areas and killing entire families. He targeted mainly farmers and migrant workers who were often living alone in isolated areas. Yang was eventually caught in 2003 after a massive manhunt, and he was found to be suffering from a mental illness. He confessed to his crimes and was sentenced to death in 2004. His execution was carried out in 2004 by firing squad, and his case is considered one of the most heinous and disturbing in Chinese criminal history. In our number 7 spot today, we have Pedro Lopez. Pedro is a man who lived a life committing some of the most horrific crimes I've ever heard of throughout South America in the 1970s. By the time the 1980s rolled around, he made a mistake during one of his awful crimes, and this thankfully led to his arrest. Once in police custody, he began to basically explain his entire life story, and he confessed to an astronomical amount of crimes. Police were a little skeptical of just how many crimes he said he committed, but Pedro was able to lead them to a mass grave where they recovered a total of 53 people's remains. Pedro, of course, went to jail, but get this, he was somehow released in 1994. I'm like, great. Just before I was born. Nice. He wasn't just sent home straight away and instead was sent to some sort of mental institution for 3 years after, but he was also released from there. So aside from the crimes he committed, are you ready for the worst part? In 2002, he was suspected of being the perpetrator of a new crime, but no one has been able to find him since 1998. Yeah, he just disappeared. That's awesome. Love it. In our number 6 spot today, we have another Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Pedrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and 1970s. He did have quite a difficult childhood, as his father was a notorious criminal who actually, really sadly, harmed and killed his mother, so this of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later in his life, and Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, starting with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. He is currently serving a prison sentence in Brazil and is known for his outspoken and very unrepentant attitude towards his crimes. While I'm sure we can all feel sympathy for the things Pedro experienced in life, it truly is no excuse for the things that he chose to do. In our number 5 spot today, we have Lavina Fisher. You may have heard Lavina's name before, and that is because she made American history when she became the first female serial killer in the United States. Wow, what a title. Sure, her parents were proud. Lavina, along with her husband John, were accused of luring travelers into their inn in Charleston, South Carolina during the 19th century and then killing them so that they could take their belongings. The couple were known for their hospitality, and many unsuspecting travelers fell victim to their deadly scheme as a result. Some stories even suggest that they had a trap door in one of the guest rooms that led to a pit where they would dump all of the bodies of their victims. Despite the numerous accusations and suspicions surrounding the Fishers, they were never formally charged with the killing. However, they were eventually caught and convicted for highway robbery and sentenced to hang. In our number 4 spot today, we have Arthur Shawcross. This man is also known as the Genesee River Killer, and his crime spree began in 1972. In trying to navigate these online guidelines, I can't exactly say who he specifically targeted, but what I will say is that while everyone on this list is particularly horrible, Arthur's crimes were some of the worst, if you catch my drift. This story, however, is a little unlike some of the others today, because after the first 2 of his crimes, he was apprehended, but for some insane reason, they allowed him to have a plea bargain where he was allowed to plead guilty to just 1 charge of only manslaughter, for which he served 14 years of his 25-year sentence. In the least surprising turn of events, once he was released on early probation, his real crime spree got started. He would go on to take the lives of 12 women from 1988 to 1989, and thankfully he was finally caught for these crimes and sent right back to prison. Of course, his initial early release was the subject of huge controversy, rightfully so, and Dr. Michael H. Stone, professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, called this early release, quote, one of the most egregious examples of the unwarranted release of a prisoner. In the end, Arthur passed away in prison while serving a 250-year sentence. He passed in 2008 after suffering a heart attack. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Hwaseong serial killer. This is the name used to describe a notorious unsolved criminal case that occurred in South Korea during the late 1980s. The killer was responsible for taking the lives of at least 10 women in the city of Hwaseong between 1986 and 1991. The victims were all found, but there was little to no evidence left at the crime scenes. The case was highly publicized and became one of the most infamous serial killer cases in South Korean history. Despite a massive investigation and the arrest of several suspects, including a man who confessed to the crimes, DNA evidence ultimately exonerated all of them. The case remains unsolved to this day, with many theories and speculations surrounding the identity of the killer. The Hwaseong serial killer case sparked significant changes in the way South Korea approaches criminal investigations, though, including the establishment of a national DNA database and the implementation of more advanced forensic techniques. In our number 2 spot today, we have Franklin DeWayne Alix. Franklin is a man who had quite an insane crime spree that lasted for about 6 months in the 1990s. Although short, it was anything but sweet. The spree started off in August of 1997 in Houston, Texas, and over the course of this spree, Franklin took the lives of at least 3 people. He committed robberies, he harmed people, he attempted to take more lives where thankfully the people survived, he kidnapped people. Literally any serious crime he could commit during those 6 months, he was doing it. In the end, Franklin was caught and put on trial for his crime spree, and he received a sentence of death, which was carried out on March 30th, 2010. Finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Dale Hausner and Samuel Dieteman. Known as the serial shooters, the crimes these guys committed are definitely on the list of fears I have, which I'm pretty sure spawned from a Criminal Minds episode. These two were actively committing these crimes between May of 2005 and August of 2006, and basically, they were arsonists who would randomly set fire to objects, but they would also drive around and commit random drive-by shootings. That's the really scary part. The fire thing is also bad, don't get me wrong, but there's just something about completely random violence that absolutely terrifies me. In the end, a series of tips is what led investigators to identify the perpetrators of these horrible crimes, in particular one from a friend of Samuel who explained that Sam had actually confessed to some of the killings one night while drinking. In Dale's trial, he was found guilty of 80 out of the 87 felony charges that were brought forth, and that was all in one single trial. The charges included the killings and attempted killings he had done, arson, animal cruelty, and the drive-bys. In the end, he was sentenced to death 6 times, and his brother, who was later found out to have assisted in some of the crimes, was sentenced to 25 years. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While Dale sat on death row, he apparently asked to be put to death as soon as possible, and in the end, in 2013, he decided to take his own life. Samuel, however, remains in prison. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlovsky, and I will see you again soon. Bye!